point of us all voting if there is another door to the nightclub of democracy where only billionaires can come in and they get 1 million votes each?
Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. It's an audio version of what you can find on public television, where I analyze global topics, sit down with big guests, and make use of little puppets. This week, I sit down with journalist and former New York Times columnist Anand Giridharadas to discuss the rise in global inequality and the way global elites tend to muck things up when they try to do good. We'll also talk about his recent profile of Bernie Sanders in Time magazine, and I'll ask him what he thinks about the 2020 Democratic field so far. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
And I'm with Anand Giridharadas, author of Winners Take All. Great to be with you, man.
Great to be with you.
I want to talk about this moment of capitalism. And you've been one of the most articulate and loud against elites. How broken is the system today, in your view?
You know, and I wrote Winners Take All in a way because there were two things that seemed to be true at the same time that were in tension. On the one hand, we do live in this era in which the great capitalists, the big winners of our time, rather than being just predators, are actually extraordinary philanthropic, give away more money than's ever been given away. They all have lofty social purposes for their businesses. There is not a Wall Street bank that does not tell you all the stuff it's doing in the community. There is not a Silicon Valley company that will tell you it's not in the business of liberating humanity in one way or another. You can't go shopping without give one, get one products. You buy this tote bag, it's going to change the world. You buy this coffee, it'll help people in Rwanda. People in Rwanda are very tired of being helped by our coffee purchases, ready to help themselves.
Have you asked them? You said.
I've talked to a lot of people who don't like being on the receiving end of this kind of savior BS. But it's true. And you go to young people on college campuses, not plutocrats, just 22-year-olds, Harvard, Yale, places, people who can do anything. So many of them now don't just want to go to make a bunch of money. They want to change the world. They want to make an impact. So that's really true. And that's the first half of the observation. But the second half of the observation is we live in an age in which those same people, that same class of people, the plutocratic elite, the very educated elite, the people who have really won from the age of globalization and all these other forces you write and think about, those same people are also, frankly, monopolists on the future. Our society works increasingly in this country in a way where those people capture almost all the benefits. Billionaires in particular have monopolized much of new income, new wealth, et cetera, et cetera. We have built a tech sector where all these industries were disrupted, and instead of opening things up, we now have fewer companies controlling more corporate power, more capital investment than before. And a world in which the bottom half of Americans over the last generation, as you know, did not get a raise on average from 40 years of head-spinning progress. Now you think about anybody watching this. What has happened in the last 40 years? Innovation, right? 40 years, amazing stuff has happened. The internet, genomics, think of what's happened in medicine in the last 40 years. Think of space. I mean, just think of the new stuff that was not part of our repertoire in the world. The rise of China and India as massive new forces in the world. And you manage to sequester the bottom half of Americans from making $1 more from any of those changes. How does that happen? Massive, massive social engineering, right? This is not a natural occurrence. It actually takes a lot of hard work to make sure that changes as big as those do not benefit the bottom half of Americans.
So are you saying that all of this, to use the term by Matt Bishop, former guy from The Economist, philanthrocapitalism, is box-checking BS, or is it well-intentioned but actually just poorly managed?
It's a mix of the two. I actually think when you go to Wall Street and I interview people in finance, one of the refreshing things that I like about those people is they are pretty sincere about the fact that the social stuff they do is essentially part of the marketing department. And they don't actually BS you that much about we're really here to liberate Afghan girls and, derivatives trading is like our means of doing that.
I mean, even the American government doesn't do a good job of saying we're out to liberate Afghan girls, so.
But you go to Silicon Valley, it's a different story. I actually do not think Mark Zuckerberg's motivated by money, and that's what scares me about him. I think in the Valley, you actually do have often this messianic view. I am genuinely trying to make the world a better place. I am here because I have figured out a piece of code, a kind of platform that if it could get everywhere, it would change the world. And so you have this spectrum from the kind of shrewd to the naive, but it ends up in the same place, which is that the people with the most to lose from actual social change, from actual reform, from things like a wealth tax, from regulating tech companies, from breaking up monopolies, the kind of people who would most suffer if we did those real forms of change, put themselves in charge of the theory, the practice, the conversation of change, and thus defang change. And so our social problems continue to multiply, and we continue to do nothing about them.
Because the lobbying capacity is great, because the special interests can capture the regulatory process, and so they are ensuring that the system maintains its inequities even as they are providing some cash to keep the people from suffering.
And each of these is a different area. So first of all, the age has allowed those who rule the roost in the economy to rule more of the roost. That's just the concentration
in
of
the US.
Wealth and income.
Right.
Then, because of things like Jane Mayer wrote about in Dark Money and other books, that economic concentration translated over the last 30,
into
40
political
years
power.
into political clout and kind of political monopolies on. And then what I'm writing about is the third phase of that, which is the conquest of kind of civil society, social change, philanthropy, doing good. Even doing good has now in some ways become the wingman of keeping the really bad things about our society the same.
So Anand, before we talk about the people on the receiving end of that not quite largesse, let me push back against you in two different ways and see what you think.
Yeah.
The first is the easier one, which is, talk to me about Bill Gates, right? I mean, here's a guy that was richest guy in the world. He's giving away half of it, right? And it in amounts that clearly seem to be, I mean, when you talk about malaria nets, I mean, the level of improved health, improved immunization, improved literacy at people not so much in the United States necessarily, but certainly when you look at the impact it's having in other countries around the world, seems to be measurable. And in some ways, indeed, much more than what the United States government is doing. And certainly without all of the neo-colonial wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that are going on. How do you address that?
Great question. If you imagine someone, and Gates is not the perfect example, but he's a good one, who did not make money by causing massive social problems. Now, Gates' monopoly actually is a massive social problem, and Gates' money is from a big monopoly. So it's not the opioid crisis, it's not Facebook, but it's not nothing. Mm-hmm. But there is still one residual problem that is not trivial.
Which is?
Power. Even if he made the money completely honorably, even if the programs he is running are totally effective, what is the point, Ian, of having democracies? What's the point of us all voting on what we do about our biggest shared problems if there is another door to the nightclub of democracy where only billionaires can come in and they get 1 million votes each, right? So it's one thing to do the work he does in other countries. That's about their sovereignty, and they got to think about whether they want him coming in or not. I think it's also a different issue when those countries don't necessarily have the capacity in the public sector to solve the problems that he's getting
And in most of those cases,
correct,
they don't.
However, he's also very active here. He's very active on the issue of education, where there's been a lot of criticism of his approach. And you got a lot of, ex-McKinsey kids with their spreadsheets coming in and sort of redesigning public education in the United States through Common Core, other things. You got Common Core pushed through a lot of states without an adequate debate or any debate at all. And you start to wonder, even if you are a totally honorable guy, what gives you the right to essentially privately govern? And a lot of what my critique is about is not just about the use of this do-gooding to cover up sins, not just about the use of the do-gooding to kind of continue making money by keeping yourself in the network, but frankly about the continued exertion of power when, in fact, the greatest challenge of this country right now is power in the hands of too few. And so what the kind of giving that Bill Gates does deepens, unfortunately, is the hold of a small number of people over the decisions of public life.
And your recommendation for him, given the fact that he has this extraordinary
Yes,
wealth,
so this is-
would then be what?
I believe, first of all, I should say, that we ought to live in an America in which there are fewer billionaires with many fewer billions to give away. However, I understand that we live down here in a sublunary world. We're not there. We may never be there in this country. And I understand that these people have the money.
In fact, we're moving in the opposite direction.
Right now we are.
Yeah.
These people have the money, and it could either be spent on yachts or given away. And so, yeah, it's probably better that right now they do something. Here's the issue. When you talk about, yes, they should give away, there are some ways of giving away that actually tend to shore up a bad system. And there's other ways to give away that would tend to accelerate the breakdown of a bad system, right? So let me give you an example of each. If you say the kind of giving that you saw after the 2008 financial crisis, we had Wall Street banks, many of whom pled out to the Justice Department for fraudulent activity in helping cause this crisis that hurt millions of people. You see the kind of do-gooding they did after that. Very cosmetic, not really changing their ways in any profound way. You donate to some women here, you donate to some black people here, you do a gala, you do some ads.
I mean, the real thing that happened was that you actually changed what was required to provide credit, right? You put a lot more in terms of reserve. The government did that. The government forced that.
I'm talking about what they did in terms of their the banks did in terms of their do-gooding efforts.
Very comparatively small. Right.
Changed nothing. But you do have, on the other hand, if you go back, look at a program like Head Start, government program. Its origin was philanthropic investment by the Rockefellers and others, the University of Iowa Child Welfare Station. They proved a model in this laboratory that probably the government wouldn't have been smart enough to figure out on its own, that if you intervene early in young kids' environment, you can change the course of their lives, right? And that got proven out. And then they mainstreamed it into policy, and 500,000 kids are in the first class of Head Start, which drastically changes outcomes. That's an example of a better kind of giving, where you're doing experimentation, as Rob Reich of Stanford calls it. You're using private money to test what the public might do one day, but then you're mainstreaming it into policy to make the system work better. On education, the kind of giving that happens a lot now is charter schools, right? So rich people give to a charter school, sometimes they get their name on it, or they get to be on the board, get to go to, as one of my characters, Darren Walker, in the book says, they get to go to their parties and tell their friends that they got 3 black boys into Yale. It doesn't really change the system. In some ways, it has changed the system for the worse. On the other hand, there's a bunch of lawyers, kind of scraggly lawyers right now, trying to win a case, multiple cases, that would actually make it unconstitutional to fund public schools differentially by property tax. Now, that is a root cause justice issue in American life. Interestingly, those lawyers see very little philanthropic money. Why? Because if those lawyers succeeded, you know what happened to every rich person's home value in America? It would go down 20, 30% because they'd lose access to their really fancy local
So in other
public
words,
school.
the kind of philanthropy that would really create more social justice in this country, you suggest will never happen precisely because it fundamentally undermines the vested interests of the people.
But before we say it'll never happen, you're probably right. But before we say it'll never happen, I would say the kind of giving that is the right giving for right now is traitor to your class giving. Billionaires calling for a wealth tax is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Now, in addition to calling for it, you could actually spend $1 billion
lobbying for it,
building grassroots support for it, training community leaders. As you know, there are trillions of dollars in tax havens around the world. Money that governments can't see, can't tax, that could fund education, so many other things. There's, again, a bunch of scraggly people who are working to identify where that money is, rat it out, draft tax treaties that would allow countries to cooperate better to see and tax that money. It's very interesting that the plutocrats don't give to causes like that. So maybe you're right that they never will. But I want to hold out a little bit of hope because I have seen since this book came out that a lot of these people are moved, understand that we live in this era that is frankly unsustainable. I think a lot of them have seen in Donald Trump the flame out of the idea that we're going to be saved by entrepreneurial heroes. The business people are smarter than everybody else. The people who caused our biggest social problems are going to be the solution. Donald Trump is the most wonderful discrediting of the kind of philanthro-capitalist thesis. So there are people who are awakening, who are moved to think differently.
You're talking about how all of this giving was socially engineered to help ensure that the rich stay really rich. Now, I mean, the biggest thing that happened in the last 40 years globally was the rise of a global middle class. The biggest thing that happened over the last 40 years is that people that had nothing suddenly have become increasingly dominant economic forces, most importantly, China. Now leave the United States. Let's look globally, because it's globalization we're talking about. And actually what you see is a rise of an extraordinary middle class. No, I'm not talking about plutocracy in China. I'm talking about the average Chinese doing vastly better, the average Brazilian doing vastly better. So in the United States, a lot of working class, they really relate to Bernie Sanders and Trump when they talk about tariffs, right? In Brazil and Mexico, the working class and the middle class say, we want free trade, because they think they've benefited from it. So I'm asking there, do you think there's something else going on? Or do you think like actually all these brilliant billionaires in the United States weren't really socially engineering globally? They only socially engineered domestically where they had their hands on political power.
I mean, I think what's interesting is, having covered India, like there are certain moments and stages of development where billionaires might benefit, as they do right now in the United States, from kind of monopolizing progress. But if you were in India 20 years ago, having a monopoly on progress and actually cutting most people off from growth wasn't a particularly smart strategy for billionaires, because there was like no one to sell your stuff to, and there was no market if 90% of people are living in poverty. So part of what's happened in India and China, in my view, is you had countries that had these self-inflicted policy wounds for a very long time, where 70, 80, 90% of people were living in poverty, and they moved away from that era in a way that, for now, has allowed the billionaire class in those countries to rise in tandem with the consuming spending classes. It's very similar to what we had happen here, earlier in the 20th century.
So at different stages of development, actually, billionaire creation of wealth through a capitalist system can be aligned with the working and middle classes.
Yes, and the way it usually works is, if you look at American history, there are these swings. There's kind of eras defined by private striving and eras defined by public purpose. And you might say in an ideal world we should do everything at the same time, but in our history, I think there's I'm a big believer in kind of a dominant culture that everybody's kind of operating within. And so if you think about the first Gilded Age, I believe we're in the second Gilded Age now, the first Gilded Age was kind of defined by that.
Pre-World War I, in the United States.
Defined by exactly what you're describing in India and China, where you had a lot of the kind of first, what we'd now call billionaires, big fortunes. And they were doing big nation-building stuff like railroads and steel and all this kind of stuff. And the good thing about that era is they create a lot of growth. They often end up building stuff for the country that you sort of have happening, certainly in India right now. And those eras are very bad for inequality. They tend to widen it. Inequality is out of control in India and China, even though you do have these classes rising. And then you get to a place where that gets unsustainable. And I think India and China will go in that direction, where you will start to have essentially problems of coordination, problems of the abuse of power. And then you kind of pivot to an age of greater public purpose, where you focus on reform. I think they will probably get to an age like that. The reality is, India, which I know better, has gotten remarkable juice out of its economy, but I think it's at some point gotten all the juice it can get from being a society that still fundamentally fails to educate most people properly, that still fails to invest in girls in any reasonable way. At some point, you kind of run out of the steam.
It's interesting because Modi, on the one hand, is clearly very aligned with the industrial class in India, and actually tariffs have gone up under him. On the other hand, personally, completely anti-corrupt, hardworking, and the people around him such as well. So as a consequence, working class turned out pretty highly for him in last election.
Well, the same thing happens here. The working class, and middle class and kind of upper middle class turned out for Trump, even though he gave most of the tax benefits to people way richer than all of them.
Anand Giridharadas, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.